welcome to this month's stay-at-home lectures as part of the stay-at-home lecture series sponsored by the Society for the History of Medicine and Health Professions. I'm Tim Nutt, director of the UAMS Historical Research Center, which is the archives division of UAMS, the medical center in Little Rock. And glad you're here with us today on this rainy day. As I mentioned, this is the Stay-at-Home Lecture Series, and it's sponsored, as I mentioned, by the Society for the History of Medicine and the Health Professions, which is the support organization for the UAMS Historical Research Center. And as I also mentioned, the HRC is the archives division of UAMS. We're Department of the Library on the UAMS campus in Little Rock. And we preserve the history. It's sort of twofold. We preserve the institutional record of UAMS. So that means we preserve departmental reports, annual reports of the university, photographs showing the documentation or documenting the progress, the buildings and so forth of the campus and its regional centers around the state. We also have a second charge, which is just to preserve the history of medicine throughout the Arkansas. So we have materials in our collections that not necessarily have to do with UAMS or have no connection to UAMS, but they document the different and various aspects of the health sciences throughout Arkansas. So as I mentioned, we're part of the library. We're located on the 5th floor of the library. Love for you to come up and see some of our collections sometimes. I'll show you some of the artifacts that we have in our collections. And you will see on your screen contact information if you'd like to send us a question or you're doing some research and need some little help with that. We're happy to help with that. The Society, as I mentioned, is the support organization for the Historical Research Center, and they support us in a number of ways, one of which is sponsoring programming such as this. And this is the monthly series of the Stay-at-Home Lecture Series. And we'd love for you to be a member of the Society if you're not already. The URL that is on your screen right now, you can click on that. Well, go to that. You can't click on it from your screen. But if you'll go to that link, it's on the UAMS Library website. You're able to fill out a membership form, and then you can send in your check later. If you'd like to bypass that, you could just go directly to PayPal, paypal.me/shmhp, and pay your dues that way and join the society. Or you can also use Venmo at shmhp and to send in your dues. The dues are relatively inexpensive. It's $15 for an individual, $25 for a family membership, and then it progressively goes up the higher levels you go. We do also have a membership level for students, which is $5, and you do not have to necessarily be a student at UAMS or even involved in medical education. You can be a student at the University of Arkansas, majoring in history, or any high school or college or university in Arkansas or around the country. We do not limit our membership to just in-state folks. So I hope you'll consider joining. The programming, as I mentioned, is one of the activities of the society, and they also help the Historical Research Center to purchase materials for our collection. So I hope you'll consider joining the society for that. This lecture series is held the first Thursday of every month from noon until 1, and our next one will be May 1st. And we'll be welcoming Rachel Trusty, who is at Bucknell University. Her title has not been nailed down yet, so I don't know. I didn't put it on here, but she'll be talking about one of the first recorded gay marriages in the state, actually in the 1880s. So I hope you'll join us for that next month on May 1st at 2025. The link that you use to join this meeting today will be the same one that you use next month to join in any future stay-at-home lectures. The link never changes. So today, I will be your speaker, and I'm going to be talking about the Kirby family and their impact on the medical community in Harrison, Arkansas. The Kirby family is it's a pretty amazing family. Over 5 generations of physicians in the family. 3 of those generations, maybe more, practiced in Harrison in Boone County up in northern Arkansas. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the Kirby family, go a little bit through their histories and talk about the impact they had on Harrison, which is pretty significant. So thank you all for joining me to learn more about the Kirby family. So we're going to start with Dr. Leonidas Kirby. I pronounce it Leonidas. There was an oral history that was done with Dr. Kirby's grandson, who is also a doctor, and I'll be talking about him. I don't have the audio, I just have the transcript. And he mentions in there, the interviewer mentions that his name, Dr. Leonidas Kirby, and the younger Dr. Kirby says, oh, we pronounced it this way. And it's spelled out the same way in the transcript. So I don't know exactly how they pronounced it. I hadn't listened to the audio. I don't have access to the audio. So if there's someone online who knows how they pronounce that name, I'll be interested in knowing. Which reminds me, if you do have a question, please feel free to type it into the chat feature on Zoom, and then we'll answer those questions at the end. So Dr. Kirby, Leonidas Kirby, he was sort of the progenitor of the doctors in Harrison, but by no means is he the progenitor of the other doctors, the previous generations. I mean, he came from a long line of doctors. But let's talk about Dr. Kirby, Leonidas Kirby, for a second. So he was born in 1850 and right on the edge of Dade and Greene counties in Missouri. So Greene County is Springfield. So he was born right on the border between those 2 counties, and he stayed there until he was about 12 years old. And when his father died when he was 12, and so he moved. He went to Kansas. But the interesting thing, his father was a doctor, Benjamin Franklin Kirby, who was born in 1828, died in 1858. So Dr. Kirby was actually 8 when he died, not 12. And then Benjamin Franklin Kirby's father, Tully Choice Kirby, was also a doctor. So it starts with Dr. Kirby, Tully Kirby, as a doctor, and then it goes to Benjamin Franklin, down to Leonidas, his 3 sons, and then some of his grandsons became doctors as well. So as I mentioned, Dr. Benjamin Franklin Kirby, the father of Leonidas Kirby, died when Leonidas was 8. So Leonidas was sent to Kansas, Lynn County, Kansas. It's just a picture of Tully Choice Kirby, Dr. Leonidas Kirby's grandfather. I just stuck that in there. But so he was sent to Kansas when he was 8 years old to live with his uncle. Now, Benjamin Franklin Kirby and Tully Choice Kirby had both attended 2 of the earliest medical schools west of the Mississippi. They were both in St. Louis. There's some confusion in the record as to whether Tully attended the Missouri Medical College or the St. Louis College of, the St. Louis College of Medicine. There were 2 colleges of medicine in St. Louis during the time, both very early. The Missouri Medical College was established in 1840 in St. Louis, and the St. Louis College of Medicine was established in 1841, also in St. Louis, obviously. And so both Tully Kirby and Benjamin Franklin Kirby attended the Missouri Medical College or the St. Louis College of Medicine. There's some conflicting information as to which one they attended, but both those institutions, the Missouri Medical College and the St. Louis College of Medicine, merged with Washington University in the 1890s. So they're considered alumni of Washington University in St. Louis. And the interesting thing about Tully Choice Kirby and Benjamin Franklin Kirby, and I know I'm throwing a lot of names at you, but according to family lore, they graduated at the same time, the same year from the universities. So whether that's true or not, haven't been able to determine, but I think it's an interesting family story nonetheless. So those two have their degrees, or they went to education, to have their education in St. Louis. So 1858, Leonidas Kirby is sent to live with his aunt and uncle in Lynn County, Kansas, right on the border with Missouri. And his uncle, guess what, was Uncle Bender. Bender was the last name. His mother's maiden name was a Bender. His uncle was also a surgeon or a doctor. So he comes naturally through this medical profession, not only through his direct line, but also, you know, his extended family. Had a lot of doctors in the extended family and in his direct family line. So O.C. Bender was a doctor in Mound City, Kansas, later moved to Fort Scott, Kansas, where he died in the 1870s. So after his uncle dies, Leonidas Kirby decides that he wants to move. He had planned on becoming a doctor. He had sort of worked with his uncle, apprenticed with his uncle, and with the hopes of becoming a doctor. He moves to Harrison in 1871. And just the obituary of Dr. Bender and a story about his daughter, Lulu, bringing his remains back to Kansas after her mother died in 1910. And he had died, Dr. Bender had died in Missouri, and he had been buried in Missouri. And then his body was removed back to Kansas in 1911. Just a side story. So Dr. Kirby, Leonidas Kirby, comes to Harrison in 1871. That time, Harrison, not yet incorporated as a city, but population there was probably around 500 people. So he came with the idea that he would go into medicine. So he settles in. This is a photo of Harrison in 1909. Didn't have access to one in the 1870s, but yeah, I imagine it probably looked a little bit like this in the 1870s, a little bit less infrastructure probably. So Kirby moves to Harrison in the early 1870s. He wants to start up his medical practice. And he's going to do a side operation, a side business with a saloon. He's going to set up a saloon with his medical business. So, and remember, when he came to Harrison, he had not yet gone to medical school. So he comes down, he had interned, apprenticed with his uncle, comes down to Boone County, and he brings a barrel of whiskey packed aboard the wagon that he brings down. So he gets to Harrison, and instead of a medical practice, he starts a drugstore on the ground level of a building, and then in the basement of that building, he installs a saloon. So he has the saloon as a side business, and then he has his drugstore. While he's there, he decides he's going to go to medical school. So he enrolls in the St. Louis College of Medicine, which it has not merged yet with Washington universities. And Leonidas Kirby receives his degree in 1876. He comes back to Harrison, and he sets up his medical practice, and he travels around northern Arkansas attending to the residents. And there's a quote that his grandson had in a newspaper article about the family, and he says that the younger Dr. Kirby recalls that his grandfather would leave Harrison on a Monday morning and travel by buggy through a wide area most of the week to see people in their homes. Runners would usually be sent out in advance of his arrival, so people would know he was on his way. He slept during wherever he was at night, and then he ate wherever he could pick up a meal. So, that circuit rider of a doctor, the famous country doctor scene where he's just going from house to house in his wagon and visiting people. The younger Dr. Kirby goes on to say later his grandfather, who was described as a short, wiry man, he was about 5'4" by all estimates, and he rode a horse on his rounds that was so tall that he had to have an extra stirrup installed so he could get up in the saddle. And he goes on to say that his grandfather sort of became a legend around Harrison in northern Arkansas. And the horse became so familiar with the doctor's territory that when the grandfather finished his calls, the horse would just automatically take him home because it was just sort of the same circuit every week. So he builds up this successful business in Harrison. And as Harrison grows, more people move in, and his business just really flourishes in Harrison. And this is the St. Louis Medical College in 1876, where Dr. Kirby would have attended. And interestingly, on one of Dr. Kirby, his reputation was not just confined to Harrison or Boone County or northern Arkansas. He was really well known all around the state. In 1904, he was elected president of the Arkansas Medical Society, very prominent role in the medical society. And then in 1911, Dr. W.A. Jaquith who worked for the Prudential Insurance Company. He was sent around to sort of look at check on the doctors who served as medical examiners for Prudential Insurance. And Dr. Kirby happened to be the one who gave medical exams to people who wanted to purchase insurance. And so Dr. Jaquith came to Harrison. He actually traveled all around the state, the map showing the red lines of where he traveled around the state during 1910 and 1911. And he gets to Harrison. He doesn't actually see Dr. Kirby because Dr. Kirby is out on a call. But in his report, Dr. Jaquith says, quote, he has learned from various sources that Dr. L. Kirby is one of the best physicians in the northern part of the state. So, his reputation is one of a very well-regarded physician in northern Arkansas, and I think around the state as well because of his involvement in the Arkansas Medical Society. So he's already made an impact on Harrison in Boone County in northern Arkansas. He's very active in the community. He passes away in 1928. His obituary, which you probably can't see on the screen, but he says, the obituary says, Dr. Kirby was one of the first to advocate against the use of alcohol with patients. So he wrote a number of papers, or gave a number of presentations to the medical society about the use of alcohol as an anesthetic, or sort of as a way to drug your patient. So he leaves a lasting impact in Harrison, not just because of what his activities, but of his sons. He had 4 sons, and 3 of them became doctors, and 1 of them became a pharmacist. So here they are on the screen. You had Frank Kirby, Franklin Beverly Kirby, who was a doctor, Alexander Crump Kirby, who was a doctor, Henry Hodgen Kirby, doctor, and then Lee Kirby, Leander Bender Kirby, which is a kind of an interesting name. He became a pharmacist. All 4 of them went to Washington University. So now you have 3 generations of physicians who have attended Washington University in St. Louis, Washington University or its predecessors. So I'm going to go now through the four sons. We're going to talk a little bit about them. So the first one, Frank Kirby, he was born in the 1870s, I believe, early 1880s, and he died in 1934. He attended the University of Arkansas. He set up his practice in Harrison after he graduated from Washington University in about 1904, 1905, something like that. So he comes back to Harrison. He builds up his practice. He's probably in practice with his father at this point. And then he unexpectedly dies in 1934 from a heart attack. It was unexpected, and that's going to have a lasting impact on his nephew, who we're going to talk about a little bit later. But his nephew, Henry Vance Kirby, had planned on going into practice with Dr. Kirby. And so those plans were sort of upended when he unexpectedly dies in 1934. Another son, Henry Hodgen Kirby, he graduated. He also attended the University of Arkansas. He graduated in about 1906, I think it was. And excuse me, probably 1903, a little earlier. He goes to Washington University as well. He graduates about 1908, something like that. And he comes back. He starts working for the medical school, the University of Arkansas School of Medicine in Little Rock, which is what's the precursor to UAMS. And the 1908 schedule of faculty members and teachers, he's listed as instructor in dermatology and assistant demonstrator of anatomy. And he worked for the university, the U of A medical department, for a number of years until his untimely death in 1922. He was out hunting ducks in Lone Oak in December of 1922, and he just suddenly died probably of a heart attack, I would imagine. The obituary, the article on here says that he was with a friend of his. They fired out of each of them fired at a duck. Uh, they went to get the birds, and then Dr. Kirby just fell over suddenly and died. So unexpectedly, again, another Kirby doctor dies, and with it, probably a lot of potential that he would have been able to serve Arkansas in a number of ways. So it's really sad that he died at such at an early age. Long obituary in the paper. This is the second part of it. Then you have the third son, Dr. Alexander Crump Kirby, and he attended the University of Arkansas as well. He graduated in 1913. He went to Washington University after he graduated from the U of A. And then he came back and he also worked for the U of A medical department, the School of Medicine here in Little Rock, dealing in pediatrics. And he worked for the university for a while. He worked for the state government a little bit with he was appointed by the state health department to work with tuberculosis patients, which eventually he contracted tuberculosis and then died in 1939, I believe. So very, very sad that all three of these doctors died so suddenly. So the fourth son, Lee Kirby, became a pharmacist. He went to the Washington University School of Pharmacy and received his degree. He moved back. He had planned to move back to Harrison to work in the drugstore, which he did. He went into business with Dr. Bill Kaufman, who was also a pharmacist, and they had the Kaufman Kirby drugstore for a long time. They started their drug business, and I think around 1908, 1907, 1908, something like that, and all the way up until 1937, they operated that drugstore. He unfortunately dies in 1942, not long after he retires. Now, there's his son, Henry Vance Kirby, who we're going to talk about here in a minute, goes into a little detail about his father. And at the same time, in the 1930s, 1920s, 1930s, his practice was boycotted a little bit by the Ku Klux Klan in Harrison. So there was a railroad strike in Harrison. The Ku Klux Klan moved in. This was about I think it was 21, and very contentious railroad strike. KKK moved in, sort of took over the strikers, the situation rather, not the strikers. But Dr. Kirby, the pharmacist, supported the Union. And so the KKK sent him a note and said, you have to support the other side. And he did not do that. And they boycotted his drugstore was boycotted for 10 years. A lot of people in the community boycotted him. And that really hurt his business, and that ultimately led to the reason why he left the pharmacy business in 1937. Of course, with revenues going down, he had kids to support, the kids going to college. He and his wife had 5 children. And So his son says, my father had quite a reputation as an honest man. I never did hear him say a cuss word. He never had a drink of alcohol. We didn't have any tobacco. He was not a church member, but he was recognized as a good citizen. In 1937, Bill Kaufman was his partner, and they had been partners since 1904. So, excuse me, I mentioned 1907, 1908, it was 1904. He says, I think my daddy must have been dipping in the till, which he kept a record of, and he maybe borrowed money from the store to help send us kids to school. So one morning he went down to the drugstore and Bill Kaufman said, Lee, you can put your hat on and go home. You don't own any part of this drugstore now. So his dad went home, um, and his son says it was very traumatic for him. He didn't have anything to do. Um, uh, but after he retired from the drugstore, he almost became a professional pallbearer. A lot of his country friends would die, and he was called upon to be a pallbearer. Um, so an interesting aspect of Dr. Lee Kirby. And as I mentioned, his son, Harvey Vance Kirby, became a doctor as well. He was one of 5 children. Uh, Henry Vance was born in 1908 in Harrison. He graduated from Harrison High School. He went to the University of Arkansas for 3 years, beginning in 1926. And then after he graduated from the U of A, he went to Washington University in St. Louis. It was a surprise. It was not a surprise since his father and grandfather and great-great-grandfather and great-great-great-grandfather had gone to Washington University. But so Henry Vance goes up to Washington University. He graduates in 1933, and he plans on doing an internship at DePaul Hospital in St. Louis. And then in 1934, his father dies. Remember, his father, Lee Kirby, passes away in 1934, I believe, 42. So he's trying to do this internship at DePaul Hospital. He hears about his father. I'm sorry, I'm getting the names mixed up. I'm sorry. Not his father. His father died in 1942. It was his uncle who died in, I think the one who died in 1934. Now I can't remember which one it was, but he was going to go in business with that doctor, his uncle. So he's at the internship at DePaul Hospital in St. Louis. His uncle dies, so he forgoes his second year of internship at the hospital, moves back to Harrison to start his medical practice or to basically take over his uncle's medical practice, which he did, and he stayed in practice until 1988. During that time, he talks, or in his oral history interview, he talks about why he decided to retire in 1988. And I want to read you a little bit about that. Both my grandfathers practiced medicine here in Boone County before they went to medical school. Said if they's going to have to practice medicine, they better. Well, that's some of the genes I got. So I never did ask people for money before I saw them. I took them as they came, and I didn't take appointments. I took appointments for a little while, but I didn't like it. I was 80 years old in 1988, and you didn't dare practice medicine without insurance. Newer doctors would come in, and they were all demanding pay before they would see a patient. And I began to get more and more indigent, and it came time to pay my liability insurance, which had doubled. I didn't have the money in my office, and I wasn't going to take it out of savings, so I shut the door. After practicing here from 1934 to 1998, with the exception of 3.5 years, which I served in the military during World War II. And that was the reason I ceased my practice in 1998, June the 10th at midnight. That's when my insurance expired. My lawyer told me and said, quote, "Whenever it comes midnight, June the 10th, 1988, you shut your mouth and you keep it shut," end quote. And that's what he meant. He knew the fear of lawsuits among the legal profession. He didn't want me to get mixed up with it. And that was the hardest thing I ever had to try to do. After I retired from practice, people would call me up at night and so forth and ask me what to do. And I just have to tell them, I'm sorry, I can't tell you. That was hard and it's kind of bad, I think. And I think it wastes a whole lot of my medical ability. I didn't like it. I didn't like to have to quit. When I got into medicine, I thought I could practice medicine until I died, but it didn't work out that way. So really sad ending for his medical practice in 1988 for Dr. Henry Vance Kirby because of the insurance practices and him not wanting to deal with insurance. So DePaul University or DePaul Hospital, as I mentioned, he attended he did his internship in 1933. In 1945 during World War II, he goes into the Army. He was a battalion surgeon and medical officer in Medical Corps from 1942 until he was discharged in 1945. 1945, he's discharged. He comes back to Harrison to resume his practice. And he was just like all the other family physicians, the physicians in his family, really civic minded, helping the community. And one of the ways he did that is that he helped to create the Boone County Hospital in 1950. Now, up until this point, there had not been a hospital in Boone County. The closest hospital that people needed to go to the doctor was either to go to Springfield or come to Little Rock. And Dr. Kirby talks about, taking people to the hospital where he would take out his front passenger seat and put in blankets and sort of put the patients in there and act as an ambulance taking them to the hospital, either in Springfield or in Little Rock. So he and other doctors in Harrison came up with the idea to found the hospital, in which they did so in 1950. Dr. Kirby became chief of staff at the hospital when it opened, and just was affiliated with the hospital for the rest of his life, or for the rest of his practice, rather. He also served as Boone County coroner from 1963 on until a number of years. So he was very civically minded, and really wanting to give back to his community and to the citizens. This is a picture of Boone County Hospital in 1950 when it opened, and then this is a picture of it today. So you can see that it's grown quite a bit. Dr. Kirby, unlike the rest of the physicians in his family, lived to be a pretty good age. He died in 1993 at the age of 85. He had been a physician for 54 years. And the obituary says when he began his practice in 1934, he delivered babies for $50 or for nothing if the expectant mother was poor. And I think that was the kind of a person, really, that the whole family were part of. So his brother, Dr. Henry Vance Kirby's brother, L. Ben Kirby, also became a doctor. Surprisingly, he did not attend Washington University in St. Louis. He actually attended UAMS here in Little Rock to get his degree. Dr. Ben Kirby moved to Baton Rouge, where he set up his practice, and he died in I think it was in the late 80s that he passed away. But Dr. Kirby dies, Dr. Henry Kirby dies in 1993 with cancer. But his legacy and his family's legacy in Harrison and in Boone County is still remembered and felt today. And today, of course, Harrison's a pretty bustling city, has a population of about 7,000 people, I'd say. And so they're just really, I think the Kirbys are still very well thought of up there. So that's my sort of very quick recap of the Kirby family in Harrison. And I'll be interested. I see that we have some questions in the chat. So I'm going to stop the screen right there, get out of that. And I'm going to move that over there. And I think that means y'all can see me on this screen. So if you're seeing the wrong screen, please tell me, and I'll switch it back around. So someone from Harrison refers to an obituary of Dr. Kirby, Leonidas Kirby, in 1926 in the Harrison Times. And then she also says, for more information on the railroad strike, see mob rule in the Ozarks, which was just published by the University of Arkansas Press. It's a book by Ken Barnes, who formerly taught at formerly taught at UCA. And someone mentions that the population is 12,000. So I'm a little off when I said 7,000. So that's sort of I think it's a really interesting story about the Kirby family, not just on their impact on Harrison, but just the simple fact that there were just so many physicians in that family. And that just did pretty much the direct line. I did not go past Henry Vance Kirby. He did mention in his interview that he had 3 children, and his son was attending UAMS here, but decided not to pursue medicine and went into, I believe, engineering or something similar to that. And I'm curious if anyone online knows, if anyone's in attendance knows this, if there are still any Kirby doctors practicing in Harrison. There's someone's doing a picture of Dr. Kirby's horse and wagon on Flickr. See if I can. Okay. I'm gonna move this over just so you can see. Hopefully you'll be able to see that. That's his horse and wagon that he used. Thank you, Coulter, for sending me that. And then Nita Gould says, Dr. Leonidas Kirby is buried in Rose Hill Cemetery. This cemetery just received the AHPP State Board's approval. That's the Heritage Department of the Department of Arkansas Heritage. Approval yesterday for the National Register status. Now it's under the National for approval. There are many Kirbys in this cemetery. Yeah. So most of the Kirbys are buried up in Harrison, obviously. That would make sense. But just their impact on the community, I know, is still really felt there. And I can't really think of another family that's had such an impact on a community as the Kirby family. And there's so much more work that needs to be done as far as research on this family. I think it's just really interesting that the commitment to helping their community through medicine I think is, excuse me, is really admirable. If anyone has a question, please feel free to use it in the chat. And while we're waiting on that, I will remind everyone, I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but these lectures are recorded. And after a little bit of editing, I added a few title slides and things like that. They're uploaded to the YouTube, the Society's YouTube channel. So, and it'll take probably about a couple of weeks to get this one up, but all of the previous presentations in this lecture series are up on the YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube and just search for Society for the History of Medicine, it'll be the first one that comes up. If you're interested in being on the mailing list to get announcements for programs that we do, please feel free to email us at hrc@uams.edu. It doesn't look like that we have any more questions, so I'm going to bid you goodbye, and I hope you'll join us on May 1st next month for our presentation by Rachel Trusty. So everyone stay dry and safe during these rainy days, and I will see you next month. Thank y'all.